So today we're going to start off with looking at the relationship between President Eisenhower and Senator Joseph McCarthy. And so we provocatively titled this program, Did Eisenhower Destroy McCarthy? And so with me today is Dr. David Nichols, who is joining us from Kansas, I believe. And he is a leading expert on the Eisenhower presidency. And he holds a PhD in history from the College of William and Mary. He's a former professor and academic dean at Southwestern College in Kansas. And he is the author of several books, including A Matter of Justice, Eisenhower and the Beginning of the Civil Rights Revolution, Eisenhower 1956, The President's Year of Crisis, and the book we are focusing on today, Dwight Eisenhower's Secret Campaign Against Joseph McCarthy. Ike and McCarthy is the main title of that one. Dr. Nichols lives in Winfield, Kansas, and I believe that's where we're talking to you from today. Dr. Nichols, thank you so much for joining us for this program.
Yes, I'm in Winfield. That's right.
And I'm going to kick us off. I think maybe what the best way to approach this is to first kind of set the stage a little bit for the audience, kind of stepping back, as I mentioned in the opening comments about the 1950s in general being a time of complexity and change and challenges. And so I'm wondering, just as we kind of launch into looking at President Eisenhower and what was happening with Joseph McCarthy in the early 1950s, if you could talk for a moment maybe about what the world looked like and what this country was dealing with, the political landscape as President Eisenhower came into office in 1953, and the challenges that were confronting him in the world, and what did the political landscape look like in our country. And so maybe if we start with that and then kind of take it from there.
Well, it was a tense time. In the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. It was a tense time in the Cold War, the Soviet Union. The threat of nuclear war was all around us. In 1957, there's a big scare about Soviet satellites possibly delivering nuclear weapons. And the war in Korea was still going on. It started in 1950, and it was still going in 1953 when Eisenhower took office. And the fear of communists was everywhere. It wasn't just Joe McCarthy, but communist subversion was a big discussion. What was happening in Cuba, which later on has a revolution, is important. And so it was a time of fear. I grew up during that period, and I remember it well that we were all scared about communist subversion and scared about World War, and we even had some episodes where kids were crawling under desks to practice for a nuclear attack and all that kind of thing. And so it was a tense time, but it usually has in the United States. I am one who says that American democracy and American civilization is now fragile and really always has been.
Thank you. And even I remember growing up in, I guess, mainly the 70s, and some of those same feelings of fear and everything throughout that existed throughout the Cold War. And I can only imagine coming out of, that time coming out of World War II and having the Korean War and sort of the uncertainty with the atomic bomb and everything else of where things were going. And so you have this war hero become our president, and Eisenhower coming into office in 1953, and pretty early on, this kind of coincides with the rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy, and you entered in the book, you kind of start setting the stage for that in 1953 again as Eisenhower takes office. So I guess juxtaposing to President Eisenhower, tell us a little bit about Joseph McCarthy's rise to the U.S. Senate, or just who he was and how he got to that point, and then we'll dig deeper into him as
well. Joe McCarthy made his first big national splash in his anti-communist crusade in 1950. I think it was February of 1950. He gave a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, and in that speech, McCarthy said, "I have in my hand the names of 205 communists in the American State Department." He didn't have those names, but he claimed he did, and continued to claim he did, though the number changed from speech to speech and from time to time. But after that, as one author put it, cameras, lights followed him everywhere. He was constantly in the news. And so by the time Eisenhower reached office in 1953, McCarthy was a big deal. And then the Republicans did win a narrow majority in the Congress in 53. And so McCarthy got to chair the Government Operations Committee, and that had a subcommittee that he could use to do hearings, accusing people of being communist or asking if they were communists, that kind of thing. And so his prominence took a step up with all these hearings at the very year that Eisenhower began his presidency.
Yes, and I have a follow-up question on that. I do want to point out, and it's in the chat as well, but for anybody listening who wants to ask questions, we feel free to start sharing those. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'm sorry I didn't mention this at the beginning, but I can probably get carried away talking with Dr. Nichols the entire time, and I know both of us would rather that we get some audience questions in there as we go along. So please feel free to add questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you're on Facebook, if you put a question in, I think we'll be able to get it from Humanities Nebraska staff helping out. So on the topic then of these hearings, what struck me in reading your book again is the idea that in a lot of it was one-man hearings. It was just it was just Senator McCarthy, and just how common was this for one senator to launch into these kinds of hearings? Had that been a practice?
No, that wasn't common. American congressmen, there are always some wild cards who do strange things, but still, no, this wasn't common, and it was good theater, and so the news media just loved it and followed it minutely. Although it wasn't just McCarthy by himself, he hired a young legal prodigy named Roy Cohn from New York, who had a lot to do with his what he was doing and advising him, and we'll get more into that later, I'm sure.
Yes, it struck me as this progressed as well that as this is unfolding in General Eisenhower's, or I'm sorry, President Eisenhower now is thinking about the different challenges he needs to address as president, and recognizing the trouble here with the McCarthy's hearings and so forth. You use terminology in the book that's military-ish. Phrases like about a campaign, the campaign, or President Eisenhower's battle plan, or deploying troops and things like that. And so was that intentional? That was as General Eisenhower is looking at this, was he thinking about as a military commander how he dealt with challenges?
Yes and no. Eisenhower is a very complex guy, and he, it's a five-star general who'd won a big war, and he knew that even using military language was to his advantage. That he won that election against L.A. Stevenson partly because of his notoriety from the war, no question about that, and so he did that. But he also thought that way. He was very strategic, if we could use that word, about everything he did. And you have to be careful about him because as a military man, he didn't think that what he said meant much. And so we're used to thinking, particularly with modern news media, that the bully, what we call, Teddy Roosevelt called the bully pulpit, that what presidents say is so important. Eisenhower didn't think what he said was very important, that he did think what he did was very important, and he was good at oh, I just got a message to ask the host to give you permission to record. Am I anyway?
Yeah, and you can just say okay. Yeah. Well, and you know what a president says, and using the bully pulpit and things like that, and it also seemed very consistent about not really wanting to talk about Joseph McCarthy publicly. And can you share a little bit about what was behind that thinking, or what was his approach to, you know, for example, I mean, it just seemed like he never referred to him by name, and could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, Chris, I couldn't find one incident where he used McCarthy's name in public. He would not do it. He just ignored him, and he explained it behind the scenes to people. He said McCarthy would just nothing he would love so much as to please him more than have the publicity caused by a president's announcement or criticism of him. And he said this he just can't stand, and so Eisenhower purposely ignored him, and still, even when he was asked questions in a news conference about McCarthy, he still would not use his name. And this did in fact get under Joe McCarthy's skin. He just, you know, this was like strategic kind of thing that you just don't give a demagogue all the attention he really wants.
Does this relate much to Eisenhower's reputation of being kind of aloof or not engaged? Which, as I read your book, it seemed that was very much a purposeful strategy rather than just a sort of, you know, to have that kind of image. Does this connect to that idea of him, of how he was approaching this as president by keeping it kind of at arm's length?
Well, yes, but some of that was a myth. He was really a very active president. He just was rhetorically not as active as we'd come to expect with Roosevelt and some of the others. And we're getting into the modern media age, but he was very intentional. And so I meant to say, talking about Joe McCarthy, that his favorite phrase was he wouldn't get down in the gutter with McCarthy, but he would not get down in the gutter with anybody, and was notorious for never criticizing anybody in public. But behind the scenes, you know, the central thesis of my book is that Dwight Eisenhower, in effect, with a clandestine operation, attempted to wrap a gay lover scandal around a prominent Republican senator in his own party in an election year. And the minute I say that, I know it'll bother some people because it was a very homophobic time, and a gay lover scandal. We have to get into that a little bit, but he did do it, and he did use it to bludgeon McCarthy in ways behind the scene where, again, Eisenhower was never personally associated with it. And so he had Nebraska and Fred Seaton do the dirty work for him. But he's a complex guy, and that's one reason that it's his ratings have changed as historians study him more, because he was not rated very highly after his presidency. But in the newest electoral survey of historians by C-SPAN just this last year, He's now ranked 5th, only after Lincoln, Washington, and the 2 Roosevelts. So historians have learned that this guy is complex, and you have to look below the layers to see what he was really doing. And he did. I mentioned Korean War before being part of this. He did negotiate a ceasefire in Korea in his first year in office. And Ike didn't like wars on the Asian mainland, and he didn't like getting into Korea or Indochina either, though his successors didn't understand that problem. But anyway, that's a whole nother issue.
That's the challenge here, is there's so many different issues and directions to go with all of this, and you've mentioned several that we can go with, and there's at least 2. I definitely want to go back to Fred Seaton because of the Nebraska connections, but before that, your comment about using kind of homosexuality as a weapon or a tool, and just this is one of those examples of thinking about how much how many different challenges there were in society, and that the 1950s were socially a different time and politically a different time and so forth. But so Joseph McCarthy was using homosexuality allegations as kind of a tool in his hearings, correct? And was that also kind of a common sort of tool that you were seeing elsewhere, or was he unique in that way?
Well, he was distinctive about it in that he was very good at it, at being that kind of demagogue, where if the truth doesn't matter to a politician, you can make any kind of accusation you want. And so he would bring people in, and if they defended their right of free speech, he would say that meant they were a communist. They were hiding and being a communist, and so he could accuse people, and did regularly, and got away with it a lot, made a lot of headlines. And to this day, we have a former president at the moment that says the last election wasn't valid, and he didn't lose it, and he still gets coverage for that falsehood. So we're a publicity community. And I ought to say about the rhetoric thing, Eisenhower, I think, was not totally right about that. Presidential rhetoric can do some important things. It can educate people, which Joe Biden's trying to do. It can express sympathy when things go wrong, when there's tragedy. President rhetoric can do many things, but what Eisenhower believed was that it couldn't do any good talking about a demagogue like Joe McCarthy, that you had to meet him, so to say, on his own level and sabotage him.
Yeah, I'm definitely getting more to that as it turned to that kind of strategy as time went on. And yeah, just you mentioning McCarthy's tactics, you can only imagine what he would do in a world of social media. So okay, yeah, that's a deep one too. But let's go back to Fred Seaton. You mentioned the Nebraskan Fred Seaton and his, but and I was familiar with Fred Seaton having a role in the Eisenhower administration, but your book really fleshes that out and talks about Seaton a lot, I think, because of how it related to the McCarthy issues. So I guess could you, just for our audience, kind of share who Fred Seaton was, and for those of us in the state here, Hastings, we're talking the Hastings area is where
the Hastings Daily Tribune was his newspaper. That's right. And the Seaton newspapers. Fred Seaton actually was born in Kansas, in Manhattan, just down the road from Eisenhower's Abilene. Ike, of course, was born in Texas, but that we don't need to get into that. He grew up mostly in Abilene, Kansas, and then Fred, as the Seaton newspaper empire grew, they bought the Hastings Daily Tribune, and so Fred became the publisher of that. He did get appointed to the Senate for a year when the senator in office died, and for a year and got a little acquainted with Joe McCarthy. I thought a lot of Fred Seaton. They'd gotten to know each other um, even before he became publisher. He called him his reserve division in military terms, ready to be sent into battle. And so when the McCarthy thing got really tricky, he said he wanted Fred Seaton on his team, and he talked Seaton into joining the Defense Department as an assistant Secretary of Defense. But Seaton's main duty was to deal with Congress and public relations, but his main duty was to deal with Joe McCarthy, and he brought him on. I've been privileged to work in the Fred Seaton papers at the Eisenhower Library, and I just think there's no question but what he had this very special mission. This reserve division was sent into battle.
Another good example of terminology, and I appreciate that when you write about Seaton, you often comment on his Nebraska ties. We're all proud of that around here. We have a couple questions from the audience, and I want to throw one out for you. Steve Shively is asking if you can speak about how Joe McCarthy got the money to do what he did, such as hiring Cohn, assuming that there weren't really political action committees in this in that time as the same way there are today. So how was he funded?
Well, he certainly had donors that contributed to him. I have to confess, I know a lot about this, but I don't know a lot about how he got his money. At the time I was doing it, it may have changed the last, I did the research on this 15 years ago and published the book 10 years ago. And the McCarthy papers, the McCarthy senatorial papers were still not open for research. And so if there's some gaps in my book, it's on that personal side, including his how he raised money, and I'm not very helpful with that. It may be that your questioner knows more about it than I do, but that would be great.
Well, I'll keep an eye on that.
But his cause was popular in conservative circles, and I'm sure he raised money on it.
Okay, great. I have another good question, and actually this is from Jim Newton, who's going to be providing our keynote this weekend in Ashland.
Well, hi, Jim. Jim's an old friend. Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, and he says, nice to see and learn from you. And his question is, while it's certainly true that Ike deplored McCarthy and his tactics, he would wonder if you would talk about Eisenhower's view of the threat of communist subversion inside the federal government. And did he agree with McCarthy that communist infiltration in the defense or state departments represented a threat to American institutions? And this is, you and I were talking about this before we started a little bit too. And when I asked just how real was the threat of communist infiltration. So if you'd like to respond to that.
Yeah, and Eisenhower was concerned about that. It issued an executive order. I'm trying to remember the name of it now. By the way, I meant to say at the outset to folks that Jim Newton knows this line because he's heard me do it before, is that the book is better than the talk. And if my 82-year-old brain doesn't remember a few things, they're still in the book. But anyway, Eisenhower did issue executive orders and was concerned about subversion and was concerned about, he okayed going ahead and executing the Rosenbergs, and he issued executive orders that made it difficult for people. The privilege as defined by the Eisenhower administration was that working for the government was a privilege, not a right. and so he was concerned about it, and did take steps partly for political reasons, but also part for the other reasons. Subversion was quite real. We were in a Cold War where we had spies on both sides. I don't think there's any question about that.
Thank you. And yeah, please, for anybody here, if you have more questions, we will, I'd be happy to pose them to Dr. Nichols. We do have a new question back more to Seaton, and the question is if you could be more specific about how Seaton went about challenging and undermining McCarthy. So how did President Eisenhower use Fred Seaton for that purpose?
Well, it's a complicated story, and I'm not sure on this kind of thing how complicated to get into it. But on January 21st, 1951, there was a meeting held in Attorney General Herbert Brownell's office. And while Eisenhower wasn't in that meeting, Brownell was his guy, no question. And had this meeting because they'd been hearing about the privileges sought for G. David Schein by Roy Cohn. And I have to back up. I'm sure I haven't given your listeners, viewers, enough background on that. G. David Schein was recruited on the behest of Roy Cohn, McCarthy's attorney, to be a special consultant to the McCarthy Senate committee, and Cohn and Schein were lovers. We know that, and it was a very homophobic time, as I said. So I know that will be uncomfortable for some of our. I don't have any patience with anti-gay prejudice myself, but in this era, not only did gays get persecuted, but in this case, Eisenhower, like most of the leaders of his time, believed that people who were identified as gay could be subject to intimidation by foreign entities. They could be subject to communist subversion because it was a society where being gay such a problem. It's hard for us to get inside of that when we now have a Secretary of Transportation who's got a gay marriage, but it was that tough. It's still not easy. It's still not good. But anyway, yeah. So when they had this meeting in the Attorney General's office and got very specific on all the things, all the privileges, because Roy Cohn was determined to get. I'm probably garbling this. Schein had been inducted into the Army, so he was a private in the Army, and Cohn's campaigned endlessly to get him an assignment in the Army that would keep him in New York with him. And the Army kept not cooperating with that. And so part of the agitation against the Army was stirred up by Cohn, who got very, very angry because he couldn't get his way and use the senator's influence to get Cohn an assignment where it would keep them together. And so anyway, at this meeting, they revealed all this. And shortly thereafter, Eisenhower recruited Fred Seaton to become this Assistant Secretary of Defense to take over this issue, and all the details that emerged in that meeting, including more that they dug up about the privileges sought for G. David Schein, and there were a bunch of them. I mean, Cohn was just harassing the Army, and Seaton was assigned to send all the documents on that, and was assigned to pull together a plan to exploit this scandal. So he became Ike's point man in doing this. So ostensibly, what the public knew was that Seaton was an Assistant Secretary of Defense with some responsibilities for interacting with the press with Congress, but underneath it, he was to work on Joe McCarthy in developing a plan to get rid of Joe McCarthy if we could. So I've stated that rather badly. Seaton was the point, and I think that's undeniable. I think it's factual. I should have said earlier on, this book is not uncontroversial. There are authors that still are not sure about it. They're not sure about what it exaggerates, what McCarthy, what Eisenhower did, and what Seaton did behind the scenes. I'm satisfied that it is proven, without question, but there's some reputable scholars who still have questions about it. And of course, the big critique of Eisenhower was that he wouldn't speak out in public. That's a hang up on the bully pulpit. He wouldn't, as you pointed out before, even use McCarthy's name. But meanwhile, my book contends that he established this clandestine operation to use a gay lover's scandal against him.
Could you shed a little more light on, referencing the Army hearings? Why did McCarthy pick the Army to dig into as far as trying to root out communism? What were his motivations there?
Well, it's a little obscure. Clearly, Roy Cohn played a big role in that. He was harassing not just the Army, but Joe McCarthy constantly, and he convinced McCarthy that he can make a big splash by going after the Army. And apparently, this is not proven for sure. Apparently, it was clear to McCarthy that with a 5-star general in the White House, his going after the Army could stir some real publicity and real attention, and it did. So I think he did it both for his reasons and because Cohn was harassing him about it. Cohn had a lot of influence over him, even though he's much younger than McCarthy. McCarthy was not a planner at heart, and he just kind of reacted and did things almost instinctively. But Cohn was, and he convinced him that he could further his cause by going after communists in the Army, even though he had no real facts on that. And those hearings start in August of 1953. So they became front page news from then on.
Yeah. And so if that was like August of 1953, then it seems like when we turn the calendar over to 1954, there seems to be a change in strategy or approach this with Eisenhower. Is there some point where there was a tipping point for Eisenhower where he said enough is enough and decided to go after, or as the book is, or as we had titled this talk, destroy McCarthy? Is there some point where he decided to just go after him more?
Well, McCarthy's Army hearings certainly played a role in it. It just infuriated Eisenhower behind the scenes. He was so upset with it. And particularly McCarthy would accuse some of the heroes of the war in Europe of being communist sympathizers. General Ralph Zwicker is one of them that he really castigated, and finally told Zwicker in typical McCarthy style that he wasn't fit to wear the uniform of the United States Army. And this was one of Ike's guys, one of his war heroes in Europe. And so, Eisenhower was infuriated about it. But the turning point, and I kind of got out of sequence on this, was this January 21st meeting in the Attorney General's office dealing with the privileges sought for David Schein. And that was called together because they had apparently sorted out that these privileges were a weakness for McCarthy if they could go after this relationship. And so that was the real turning point. And Seaton took over shortly after that and began to draw that together and do a report. He worked on a report that eventually got released on March 11th, 1954, on the privileges sought for D. David Shine, and that report was issued by the Army, ostensibly. And even though Seaton was behind it, Eisenhower was behind it, but neither of their names connected with it. It was released by the Army. Robert Stevens, the Secretary of the Army, was putty in Seaton's hands for doing that, and so it was made to appear that it was the Army fighting back against the Army McCarthy hearings.
So when did this is getting more in thinking about the journalism side of this, and you saying all the attention in the news. I mean, I'm just trying to imagine what the news coverage would have been like throughout this evolving topic, and I was also about Edward R. Murrow in particular. Like, when does he come into the picture where he starts shining a journalistic spotlight on McCarthy?
Yeah, I'm sorry, the screen froze on your question. Am I repeating it?
Oh, sure. No, not at all. Sorry for the bad connection to anybody out there.
Yeah, it may be my Kansas internet, so.
Certainly not Nebraska's internet. No, just kidding. My question was about thinking about the media coverage of all this, and specifically, really, when did Edward R. Murrow start shining, his spotlight onto what McCarthy was up to?
Well, there were other contributors, and the traditional interpretation of what did in McCarthy was Edward R. Murrow and his very famous broadcast, anti-McCarthy broadcast on March 9th, 1954. And I'll have you note that the report on Cohn and Shine gets released just 2 days later. So the Eisenhower forces were being very strategic about that. The tradition has been that Murrow certainly contributed, and that broadcast is a wonderful broadcast where Murrow says eloquently, "We will not walk in fear one of another." He really went after McCarthy, and that was only also almost the same day that Senator Ralph Flanders, a Republican senator, attacked McCarthy on the Senate floor and accused him of having a campaign that was absolutely awful. And anyway, and so there was a growing chorus of upset about McCarthy, and these privileges sought for D. David Shine. And so that's when Seaton released this report, but as I say, not with his name on it, not with Eisenhower's name on it, on behalf of the Army. And it caused a fuss. There was such a fuss that very soon they began to talk about holding hearings. We're hearing about hearings these days, aren't we? Know how that happens in Washington. People get upset enough about something, you finally have hearings. And the hearings ended up being what came to be called the Army McCarthy hearings. And they were set up separate really from McCarthy's committee, but he was a star witness in it. And Army McCarthy hearings were based on chasing down the allegations in the Seaton report, except it wasn't known as the Seaton report, it was the Army report. And that went on for most of 2 months. And it was on television. And McCarthy showed what a demagogue he really was on television. It really helped destroy him. I hadn't mentioned, we get out of sequence on this. McCarthy, you have to understand how popular he was. In January of 1954, McCarthy had a rating in the Gallup poll of 50% positive, 29% negative. Pretty high positive. But he was upside down in the polls by the time the Army McCarthy hearings ended in July. They started in April and ended in July 1954. And And probably everybody knows that he then was censured by the United States Senate. But censuring, I've always said, to use a bad metaphor, is the skeleton at the feast. He was already destroyed politically, and when the Senate censured him, it just kind of put the frosting on the cake. If you get another bad metaphor, he was really done for by the time those hearings ended.
Sorry, I was muted there. I'm rusty on the Zoom side of things, I think. I was going to ask about that, if just, that censure, that movement of censure was kind of the end of it for McCarthy. If really after that point, did he become kind of a non-factor? I mean, and did the public kind of recognize that as well as within?
No, it finished destroying his reputation. The allegations were by some good sources that when McCarthy then went into the Senate dining room while people deserted him, if he got up to speak, the Senate emptied. He was really a non-entity in all kinds of ways. And I haven't emphasized adequately how much Eisenhower really thought McCarthy was dangerous to American democracy. He said early on, my friends tell me it won't be long in this army stuff before McCarthy starts using my name instead of the Secretary of Defense Stevens. He's ambitious. He wants to be president. He's the last guy in the world who'll ever get there if I have anything to say. So Eisenhower's operation had succeeded in really tarnishing his reputation by the time that the censure came about. And I was fishing in my papers here for what happened to him afterwards. Bear with me a moment.
When Dr. Nichols, as you're looking for that too, I'll be curious to hear your thoughts about when Eisenhower reflected back later about all of this, if his opinion had changed at all from, on that danger to our democracy.
Not finding what I was looking for, so I shouldn't be shuffling papers. Well, let me do what I can remember of what I was going to read to you, because it was quite specific. But John Adams, who was the Army counsel, went to McCarthy's house after the censure and let McCarthy talk him into coming in to see him, and he went to see him, and he was just appalled. This is in early 1955, appalled at the image of McCarthy. He looked awful. He lost weight. McCarthy was a heavy drinker, and he sat down to drink, and the brandy trickled down his face. He couldn't even get the brandy down in very ways. He just was in awful shape. And Adams recalls when he left him, he saw him as the man dying. The image of the successful man was gone, and he did in fact die, I think, in March 1955 at the age of 48. And so the allegation that he drank himself to death is probably accurate. He was a real alcoholic. And so he's utterly destroyed, and his movement is very much diminished after that. So much happened to him that it just didn't, there wasn't much left of the McCarthy movement at that time.
So Dr. Nichols, that made me think about looking from President Eisenhower's point of view, who Eisenhower passed away March 28th, 1969.
Yes.
And I happen to know that because that's the day I was born. Not that I have any delusions of grandeur, but
really? Really?
But I'm wondering later in life how President Eisenhower look back and did he speak more about that whole controversy later as he reflected on his presidency and
Well, yes, he did.
you know,
Wrote an article for the Reader's Digest, and that was published after his death, as a matter of fact. But one thing I failed to say was that even in discussion, once McCarthy was disgraced, he got a kick out of talking to cabinet meetings by saying, you know, it's no longer McCarthyism, it's McCarthyism. And he didn't mind taking a little bit of credit for that. And then the article he wrote for the Reader's Digest just before he died was, we must avoid the perils of extremism. And you know, I never publicly condemned Joe McCarthy. That finally, this article published just after he died, that he finally did denounce Joe McCarthy. Although even then, typical Ike, he went through and took out some of the harshest stuff in the article and edited it down a little bit. That he just never would use the kind of purple rhetoric that we like to have from politicians.
Well, thinking about the perils of extremism, it kind of leads me to maybe a wrap-up question, because I think we're kind of coming to a close here a little bit, but that's maybe about the lessons for us today as we think about you know, the world we're in and reflect on all of this happening in the early 50s. What do you I guess it's a double question, is thinking about what do you think the lessons are from the whole McCarthy challenge to us now, and also how do historians look back on it now? I mean, you mentioned, you know, maybe there's not agreement on some of the topics within your book in particular, but just do historians look at Eisenhower differently now than they did at the time? So I don't, either one of those that you want to address first,
No.
but otherwise.
Well, as I say, he's ranked now, the poll of historians ranks fifth among presidents. And so he's ranked very highly anymore. And so I think the historians generally agree on that. They don't agree on all the specifics, but my personal view of this is that American democracy is fragile. It always has been. I mean, good grief, we fought a civil war in this country. It's fragile. And the founders set up a system of government with indirect democracy because they were fearful of democracy. James Madison and some of the other founders were articulate about saying they thought that pure democracy could be exploited by a demagogue. Does that sound like Joe McCarthy? and that pure democracy was dangerous, and so they did indirect democracy. It was a republic, not a democracy. And Ben Franklin famously said, "It's a republic if you can keep it." And so so they made it very indirect. So you know, the Senate of the United States is not strictly democratic. I hear a lot about the Senate these days. I mean, California has 2 senators and Wyoming has 2 senators. I mean, the population is hugely different. So that's not just democratic. And the Electoral College in particular is anything but democratic. And so I think we've always had this fragility that was built in at the outset, and to some extent, the founders in 1787 made a deal with the slave owners that they could count 3/5 of their slaves, even though they didn't vote in population of this. And the scholars who are really good on this say that some of that still carries over in modern representation in the House of Representatives, even though we no longer have slavery. And some of that got built in at the outset. In the Electoral College, Donald Trump didn't win a majority of the popular votes. So the founders set up this so that the Electoral College was chosen by a handful of people rather than by counting the vote. So anyway, so I'm supposed to ask you to let me record again, but I'm sure I'm going over. But I think we're always fragile, and I think we are now and will continue to be. It's in the nature of the thing, and that if we think we're not knowing the danger right now, Donald Trump um, uh, was coached by Roy Cohn for 13 years and how to be as obnoxious as Joe McCarthy, and he succeeded rather well.
Well, I think about democracy being fragile and politics being kind of a messy and ugly business are both very, very true. And I think that as long as we recognize the fragility of our democracy and that it's not just a spectator sport, that we all need to engage in our democracy, that goes to the very founding of the Humanities Councils and the National Endowment for the Humanities, is that it's part of our job as citizens to be informed and engaged. And today was a good example of exploring these issues. And we really
I couldn't agree more, Chris. Thank you for that statement.
You bet.